So we wrap up Genesis and end up in Exodus, the second book of the Bible. Now, Exodus continues the story, albeit a little later on in the chronology of it all, of Genesis. And so, this Exodus book, we're going to divide it up into two parts for our video series, and then also you might just kind of in your own mind as you read it, um, roughly 1 through 19, chapters 1 through 19, and then 20 through 40. So that first half or so is filled with those stories you may have heard growing up. Uh, Moses and Pharaoh and the plagues and crossing the Red Sea and let my people go. It's sort of narrative, it's story. And then somewhere around chapter 20, it starts to begin to move into Moses's reception of the law from God. A lot of rules, a lot of do this, don't do that. And it's not a clean break. It overlaps a little bit, but that's essentially for our purposes how we're going to divide it. So let's talk about that first half today. So it opens up, Exodus does, by saying that these people of God, the Israelites, the people who were supposed to be worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph. You remember those guys from Genesis. It had been hundreds of years since Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And somewhere in those hundreds of years, they had become enslaved by the Egyptians, by Pharaoh, who was the sort of the dictator of Egypt. And over these generations in slavery, they had forgotten about God. But of course, the God of their ancestors hadn't forgotten them. And so this guy Moses who was an Israelite, ends up, because of a course of events that you've read about or you will read about. Moses ends up in Pharaoh's court and a servant of Pharaoh, not a slave, and he escapes and he goes to find this burning bush that God speaks to him through, and God calls Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go, free the people." And so Moses goes and says that to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says no, and then there's these plagues, and let my people go, no plague. Let my people go, no plague. And there's several of them. They they eventually get out. They cross the Red Sea, and they end up journeying to Mount Sinai and are consecrated as reconsecrated as God's people. That's a very brief overview of it. So here's a little interesting part that we read about is Moses trying to figure out, okay, who is God? And at the burning bush, Moses says, "What is your name?" And God says, "I am who I am. I am who I am," which is on one hand um, almost sort of clear, like this is exactly who I am, and on the other hand, of course, it's extremely vague. There's no name attached to it. And so sometimes, especially in the Old Testament, you read that second point there, the Lord, in all caps, but sort of in smaller lettering, and it looks kind of out of place, like the font looks a little weird. And that is a way of honoring the fact that God doesn't give Moses his name. The name that we do get is this right here. It's in English, it's transliterated YHWH. And then this right here is the Hebrew translation. We call this the tetragrammaton, which is Greek for four letters, tetragrammaton. And so if we try and pronounce this name, YHWH, we get Yo, Hey, Va, Hey. Those are the four letters. Yo, Hey, Va, Hey. It almost sounds like you're breathing in, Yo, Hey, Va, Hey, like that. Sounds like God is like the name of God is like the air that we breathe, which you can go down that rabbit hole, right? And go pretty deep there. So why does it say instead of uh, YHWH, why does it say the Lord? Well, um, because it's hard to pronounce. Yeah, I mean, if we go with the four letters, we can do each four individually, but even in English, try and pronounce this word, YHWH. It's impossible to pronounce. You can't really put those together, and that's on purpose. Um, a lot of good Jews, and this is Jewish scripture before it's Christian scripture, um, a lot of good Jews would actually say that it's disrespectful to pronounce the name of God, that we're not worthy to pronounce the name of God. And so sometimes you'll hear the name Yahweh for God. That's sort of an attempt to make that into something you can pronounce. But but that's actually it's not pronounceable, which is kind of the point. And so there's a couple other names we get for God besides that. So use the Tetragrammaton here, and then the other one is Adonai. We see that in the Old Testament. And so neat little thing that has been done is to take the in English, what are the consonants from the first one from the Tetragrammaton, and the vowels. Yes, I there is a vowel also, but A and I combined in the Hebrew, and the vowels A, O, and A, and mush them together, and you get this word, which transliterated back to English is Jehovah. That's where you get all that. So it really interesting little thing going on with God's name that Moses is trying to. Moses is like both in awe and totally confused by God, which is kind of maybe the point. And then there's these plagues, and there's plagues of locusts and livestock dying, and it, notice Exodus doesn't try to like explain these plagues rationally, much in the same way that back in Genesis 1 and 2, we don't get this really specific evolutionary biology. It's just the first day God created this, second day God created that. But it's not explained rationally. It just says this happened. And it's just sort of this affirmation that, yes, God uses the natural world, what's already here, to bring about his purposes. And so in these plagues, you get this back and forth, this contest of wills between Pharaoh and God. Moses is speaking for God, and Moses says, let my people go. Pharaoh says, no, let my people go. No, let my people go. No, it's this back and forth. And eventually Pharaoh does let his people go, but then he has second thoughts and he starts chasing them until they finally drown in the Red Sea. And it's clear that Pharaoh has this, what I'll call a disposition to cruelty. He is a cruel person. If he were he is all power. Pharaoh is just about all powerful in Egypt. Whether he had all that power or not, he would be cruel. That's the kind of person Pharaoh is. And it's sort of this lesson that power kind of accentuates or exaggerates who you already are. So let's use money as an example. So if you're somebody who has who is generous, that's just who you are. You're a generous person. You're going to be generous whether you have very little or whether you have a ton. If you're stingy, you're going to be stingy whether you have very little or whether you have a lot. That's a little bit like what we're getting with Pharaoh. Pharaoh is just a cruel person, and there's kind of a parable in there as well. And so then off they go after the Red Sea. They journey to the Promised Land, and that's what the rest of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is about. Frankly, is the Israelites' journey to the Promised Land. Remember, the two promises that Abraham gets are promises of land and descendants. We'll see that God is sending them to a specific place, to the Promised Land, and along the way telling them, this is how you make a civilization. You gotta have descendants, right? This is how you make a civilization. This is how you live together and continue a sort of family tree. And when we take a step back, it is these imperfect, fragile people who are led by a regular guy chosen by God. That's really all it is. They're not otherwise all that special. They're imperfect, fragile people led by a regular guy chosen by God. And they finally make it to Mount Sinai, and here comes some instruction. And we'll talk about that in the next video.